The wind on the plains had teeth, and it bit first, long before the sun ever thought about cresting the horizon. It howled through the warped shutters of the bunkhouse, rattling loose nails like a ghost pacing the edge of the world. Dust devils danced in the pale dawn light, making the whole world look bruised, colored in copper and ash. Even the sky seemed angry, holding back the rain it had promised for weeks. In the small cookhouse, leaning against the main ranch house like a tired afterthought, Elva Jameson was already at war with the day. The room was small, the walls stained black with years of smoke. An old iron stove sat in the middle of it all, a hungry beast that always demanded more wood. Her hands were raw, but they moved with a rhythm born of desperation, chopping, stirring, and tending to the bread she'd started before the first rooster crowed. She was 28, but the hardship had etched lines on her face that belonged to a woman twice her age. An orphan who'd drifted west on a tide of broken promises she'd washed up here with nothing but her name and a stubborn refusal to die. The bread was her last chore before the ranch hands stomped in, their voices loud and their boots caked in mud. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her hair sticking to her temples. She checked the stove. A wave of heat hit her face, hotter than she'd judged. Smoke was coiling from the oven door. The edges of the loaf were already turning black, blistering under her watch. She bit her lip, yanked the pan, and fiddled with the damper, praying it wasn't too late. The door creaked open. Dusty Carver stood there, a ranch hand with a grin as sharp and cruel as a spur. He leaned his shoulder against the frame, his eyes sweeping over the tiny room with a lazy contempt. "Hope you got it right this time, woman," he drawled. "Last batch nearly broke my teeth." His laughter was like metal scraping on stone, and two other hands behind him joined in. Elva's chest went tight. She didn't say a word, just kept her eyes on the loaf, willing it not to betray her. But when she pulled it from the stove, the truth was right there for everyone to see. The crust was scorched, blackened, and bitter. The smell of failure filled the tiny room. Carver pounced. "Well, look at that," he sneered, stepping forward. "She's gone and burned it again. Can't even make bread without ruining it. What good is a cook who can't feed a man?" His hand shot out and snatched the loaf. He held it up high, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The laughter from the other men swelled, and they pressed in close, the small room suddenly thick with their cruelty. Her throat closed up. She wanted to explain about the stove, about the 100 other things she had to do at once, but excuses were just another word for weakness out here. So she stood there, silent, her shoulders stiff, her hands trembling against her worn apron. Carver's voice cut through the noise. "Maybe she needs a reminder of her duties." He shoved the burned loaf into her chest, the hard crust digging into her ribs, crumbs scattered across the floor. Then he hit her. It wasn't a punch, just a quick, brutal backhand across the face. The blow sent her stumbling backward, her body slamming against the hot iron stove. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips, but she choked it back down. Pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. The other men just laughed, a sound as empty and cruel as the wind. One of them gave her a shove, sending her reeling again. Another one called her bread burner, and the word hit harder than the slap. Shame burned hotter than the stove. It seared through her chest, flooding her eyes with tears that blurred the dim light of the cookhouse. She was trapped. And then a sudden heavy silence fell over the room. It was the kind of quiet that drops out of nowhere, so unnatural it makes your ears ring. Carver froze, his arms still raised. The other men went stiff, their boots scuffing nervously on the wooden floor. They all turned toward the door. In the doorway stood Jedediah McGraw. He wasn't a big man, not in the way that Carver was. He didn't fill the space with noise or threats. His authority came from somewhere else, from a deep, unshakable gravity. He was the rancher, the owner of every inch of this dust-choked land. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, with eyes the color of a stormy sky. He spoke little, but when he did, men listened. His presence was enough to silence barking dogs and make grown men question their own worth. His gaze landed on Carver, then slid over the other two, slow and unblinking. He said nothing. He just watched. The weight of his stare was enough to make the air itself hold its breath. Carver shifted on his feet, the burned loaf still clutched in his hand. He tried to muster a grin, but it died on his lips under Jed's relentless gaze. She burned the bread again, Jed. Just letting her know. Enough. Jed's voice was quiet, but it cracked through the room like a rifle shot. The men lowered their eyes. The laughter was gone, vanished into the dust motes dancing in the air. Jed stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. His boots thudded against the floorboards, each step a judgment. He walked right past Carver and stood between Elva and the men. He took the blackened loaf from Carver's hand and placed it gently on the table, as if even a ruined piece of bread deserved more respect than these men. Then he turned, not to Elva, but to them. Any man, he said, his tone as flat and hard as the prairie itself, who thinks striking a woman makes him stronger has no place calling himself a hand of mine. Carver swallowed hard, his face turning a blotchy red. Pride and fear wrestled across his features. But Jed's stare was a wall he couldn't climb. The other two men just backed away, muttering excuses, retreating like shadows at sunrise. Jed didn't stop there. He looked Carver dead in the eye. His voice was still quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried a terrifying finality. Pack your things. Carver's jaw dropped. What? Jed, you're done here. Jed cut him off. Get off my land, now. There was no arguing. The authority in his voice was absolute. Carver, stripped of his audience and his pride, threw the loaf on the floor in a final pathetic act of defiance. He shot Elva a look filled with pure hatred, a look that promised this wasn't over. Then he turned and stormed out, his footsteps echoing his defeat. Elva pressed a hand to her throbbing arm where it had hit the stove. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare meet Jed's eyes. But in that ringing silence, she felt something shift inside of her. A line had been drawn where there had been none before. A wall had been built. Jed finally turned to her. His stormy eyes fell on her face, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in their depths. It wasn't pity. It wasn't softness. It was just acknowledgement. Tend to your arm, he said, his voice rough. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening quiet. The burned bread lay on the floor, a testament to her failure. But something else lingered in the air now. The ghost of a defense, the echo of a quiet power she had never witnessed before. She stood there, breath caught in her throat, a new and unfamiliar storm stirring in her chest. Outside, the wind howled, sweeping across the endless plains, carrying the scent of a long overdue rain. But as she listened, her heart thundering against her ribs, she had a sinking feeling that Jed's protection had just painted a target on her back. In a land where gossip spread faster than a prairie fire, a rancher's unexpected kindness was a currency more dangerous than gold. And Elva knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the storm that was coming for her had nothing to do with the weather. It was a storm made of whispers and lies, and it was just getting started. The nearest town was a collection of crooked buildings huddled together in a shallow valley, as if seeking shelter from the vast, empty plains. It had one dusty main street, a saloon with swinging doors that never stopped creaking, and a general store that smelled of flour and old secrets. Elva rode in on the supply wagon a few days later, a list of necessities folded tightly in her hand. Her arm, wrapped in a clean bandage beneath her sleeve, still ached with a dull throb, but it was the bruise on her cheek, now a sickly yellow-green, that was harder to hide. She kept her chin low, hoping to be invisible, to slip through the town like a ghost. But a town like this feeds on weakness. It never lets the wounded pass by unnoticed. The first whispers started at the town well. Two women, their faces pinched and righteous, stopped drawing their buckets as she approached. Their eyes flicked to the bruise on her face, then they leaned their heads together, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "That's the one of them murmured, loud enough for Elva to hear. "The bread burner. Got Carver thrown off the McGraw ranch." The other woman snorted. "Took her side, he did. Strange that. A man like McGraw doesn't stick his neck out for a clumsy cook. Unless—" She let the word hang in the air, thick with insinuation. They shared a knowing little laugh, a sound like dry leaves skittering across the dirt. Elva's steps quickened. She hurried into the general store, the bell above the door jangling like an alarm. Mr. Harper, the man behind the counter, gave her a polite but cool nod. His eyes lingered on her bruised cheek for a moment too long before he took her list. He filled her order with a slow, deliberate precision, as if touching the items she needed might somehow contaminate him. When she stepped back outside, a sack of flour heavy in her arms, she almost ran right into a wall of men. It was Carver. He was leaning against a post with two of his cronies, his face unshaven, his eyes bloodshot with cheap whiskey and rage. His grin spread slow and wide, a predator scenting blood. "Well, if it ain't the bread burner herself," he said, his voice loud, meant for the whole street to hear. He tipped his hat in a mockery of respect. "Careful with that flour, boys. She's liable to set the whole town on fire." A ripple of cruel laughter went through the small crowd. Heat flooded Elva's cheeks, a burning shame that was hotter than the midday sun. She clutched her sack tighter and tried to push past him, but he stepped into her path, blocking her way. He leaned in close, his breath a foul mix of whiskey and rot. "Heard McGraw's got a soft spot for you," he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "Wonder what you're doing to earn your keep now that you ain't just burning bread." Her throat went dry. She wanted to scream, to hit him, to run, but she was frozen, trapped by the dozens of eyes watching her, judging her. She just stood there, her shoulders hunched, making herself small. That's when another voice, sharp and musical, cut through the tension. "Leave the poor thing alone, Thomas." It was Lillian Boonhart, the owner of the saloon. She was leaning in the doorway of her establishment, a slash of scarlet silk in a world of brown and gray. Her smile was as bright and hard as polished glass. She looked Elva up and down, her dark eyes missing nothing. "She can't help it," Lillian continued, her voice carrying across the street. "Some women are just born to make a mess of things. It's a wonder Mr. McGraw keeps her around at all." She turned to the man beside her. Then again, a lonely man on a big ranch. He must have his reasons. The man chuckled, and Lillian's laugh joined his, a sound like breaking glass. The meaning was clear. The poison had been delivered. Elva's reputation was now as scorched as her bread. She finally managed to stumble past Carver, his laughter following her down the street, clinging to her like mud. Even the marshal, Wyatt Cololton, a tall, rigid man whose badge glinted in the sun, saw her shame. He stepped out of his office, and his eyes slid right over her, as if she were nothing more than a piece of trash blowing down the street. In this town, the law didn't protect people like her. It just ignored them. By the time she got back to the ranch, the supplies felt 100 times heavier. She hadn't just brought back flour and salt. She had brought back a new identity. She was no longer just the orphan cook. She was Jed McGraw's charity case. Or worse. That night, as she served the evening meal, the silence at the long table was different. The other ranch hands didn't mock her. They didn't even look at her. They just ate, their silence a thick, heavy blanket of judgment. Jed came in last, his presence, as always, changing the air in the room. He took his seat at the head of the table and ate with his usual slow deliberation. When Elva set a pot of beans down in front of him, Their eyes met for a fleeting second. She saw no pity in his gaze, but she saw something else. Recognition. He knew what she had faced in town. He knew, and he hadn't said a word. The meal ended. The men scraped their chairs back and shuffled off to the bunkhouse. Elva was left alone, clearing the dirty plates, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. She turned from the sink, and her breath caught in her throat. Sitting on the edge of the table, where no one would have seen it but her, was a small burlap sack. It was filled with coffee beans, a luxury she hadn't tasted in years. No one claimed it. No words explained it. But she knew. She knew whose hand had left it there. She picked it up, the rough burlap a comfort against her palm. The rich, earthy scent of the beans rose up to meet her, a small warmth in the cold, lonely cookhouse. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a rescue. It was something quieter, something heavier. It was a silent acknowledgement. I see you. A flicker of solace ignited in her chest, but right behind it came a cold spike of fear. The town's whispers had teeth. A gesture like this, no matter how small or secret, was like blood in the water. This quiet kindness, this unspoken alliance, wouldn't save her. It was going to get her killed. Because as she stood there, clutching the small sack of coffee, she realized a terrible truth. Jed McGraw hadn't just fired Carver. He had started a war, and she was the battlefield. That night, a storm finally broke over the plains. Thunder rattled the windows of the small cookhouse, but Elva knew the real storm was the one brewing in town, a storm of hate and jealousy, and it was moving right toward her. The coffee beans became her secret. She kept them hidden in an old tin box beneath a loose floorboard, a small treasure in a life of scarcity. At night, after the ranch hands were asleep and the only sound was the wind, she would grind a few beans by hand and brew a single precious cup. The rich, dark aroma filled the small cookhouse, a shield against the ghosts of the day's insults. It was more than coffee. It was a promise, a silent conversation between her and the one man who saw her as more than a failure. Days turned into weeks. The bruise on her cheek faded, but the whispers in town only grew louder, more venomous. Carver, jobless and bitter, spent his days poisoning the well of public opinion, spinning tales of Elva's supposed wickedness. Lillian Boonhart fanned the flames from her perch at the saloon, her laughter a constant, cutting reminder of Elva's shame. But something inside Elva was changing. The fire that had scorched her bread had ignited something in her soul. She started to fight back, not with words, but with actions. She poured all her pain and frustration into her work. The bread she baked was no longer scorched. It was perfect. The crusts were golden brown, the inside soft and warm. The stews she made were rich and hearty. The ranch hands noticed. The complaints stopped. They still didn't speak to her, not really, but a new, grudging respect began to settle over the dinner table. They ate her food with a quiet intensity, and for the first time, the plates came back to the kitchen empty. It wasn't praise, but it was enough. Jed watched her too. He never said a word about the change, but she felt his eyes on her. He would linger in the doorway of the cookhouse for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze seeming to take in everything at once. The steady rhythm of her hands kneading dough, the careful way she measured the flour, the determined set of her jaw. His quiet presence was a constant hum beneath the surface of her days, a source of both comfort and a strange, unnerving tension. One evening, a thick fog rolled in from the plains, swallowing the ranch in a blanket of gray. The world shrank to the warm circle of light cast by the cookhouse lamps. Elva was alone, washing the last of the supper dishes, when the door opened and Jed stepped inside. He moved to the stove, holding his cold hands out to the warmth. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "The men are saying the north fence was cut," he said, his voice a low rumble. Cattle scattered. Elva's hands stilled in the soapy water. Sabotage? He nodded, his eyes dark. Third time this month. First the well was fouled. Then the tools from the smithy went missing. Now this. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and piercing. Someone's trying to break us. A cold dread trickled down her spine. This wasn't just about her anymore. The attacks on the ranch, the sabotage. It was an escalation. Carver's bitterness was turning into something far more dangerous. "He's trying to ruin you," she whispered. "He's trying to get to me," Jed corrected, his voice grim. "Through you, through my ranch." The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. Her presence here was the catalyst. Her shame was the weapon they were using against him. The weight of it was crushing. Maybe I should leave," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "If I'm gone, maybe they'll stop." Jed took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "And go where?" he asked, his voice rough. "You think their lies won't follow you? You think running will save you?" He shook his head. "The only way to beat a fire is to stand your ground and fight it." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. He placed it on the table beside her. It wasn't a sack of coffee. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, worn smooth with age. Its lines were simple but elegant, the work of a patient and loving hand. Elva stared at it, her heart pounding. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "My wife carved it," Jed said, his voice so quiet she could barely hear him over the wind. She was like you, strong, didn't back down from a fight." He didn't look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. "She died a long time ago, in a fire." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Elva finally understood the depth of his silence, the source of his solitary strength. He wasn't just a quiet man. He was a man hollowed out by grief. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the small bird. It was warm, as if it still held the heat from his pocket. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because," he said, finally meeting her eyes, "her bird deserves to be with another." His gaze was intense, filled with a meaning she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't love. It was something deeper, something forged in shared pain and a mutual refusal to be broken. A cold dread suddenly washed over her. This wasn't just a gift. It was a secret, a connection, a weakness that their enemies could exploit. She quickly picked up the bird and hid it in her apron pocket, her mind racing. This changed everything. The stakes were no longer just her reputation. Jed had shown her his vulnerability, his one exposed nerve. And in doing so, he had given their enemies the perfect weapon. The wind howled outside, and in its mournful cry, Elva heard a warning. The sabotage was just the beginning. The whispers were just the first few sparks. A real fire was coming, a fire meant to burn them both to the ground, and she had a terrible feeling she knew exactly who was holding the match. The air on the prairie grew thick with unspoken threats. The cut fences and the missing tools were just the start. A week later, Jed's prized bull was found dead, poisoned. The ranch hands grew restless, their fear curdling into suspicion. They started looking at Elva differently again. Carver's poison had seeped deep into the soil of their minds. They saw her as a curse, a magnet for trouble. Elva felt their eyes on her back as she worked, a constant, heavy pressure. She clutched the small wooden bird in her pocket, its smooth surface a small comfort against the rising tide of fear. It was her secret, her connection to Jed's hidden pain, and the one thing that reminded her she wasn't alone in this fight. Jed grew harder, his silence stretching into a grim, watchful stillness. He rode the perimeter of his land from dawn until dusk, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. But the sabotage was like a ghost. It struck without warning and left no trace, save for the destruction it left in its wake. The breaking point came on a moonless, starless night. The air was unnaturally still, the wind holding its breath. Elva was in the cookhouse, unable to sleep, her nerves stretched thin as a wire. A strange orange glow on the horizon caught her eye. At first, she thought it was the sunrise, but it was too early, and the light was in the wrong place. It was coming from the north pasture. She ran outside, her heart seizing in her chest. The glow was growing, pulsing like a malevolent heartbeat. Then a shout ripped through the night. Fire! The ranch exploded into a symphony of chaos. Men poured out of the bunkhouse, their faces pale with terror in the flickering light. Horses screamed in their stalls, the smell of smoke driving them mad with panic. The fire was a roaring, hungry beast, a solid wall of flame moving across the dry grass with terrifying speed, pushed by a wind that had suddenly sprung to life. Jed's voice cut through the pandemonium, sharp and commanding. Bucket line to the well! Now! Move! The men scrambled to obey, their movements clumsy with panic. A line formed, buckets of water passed from hand to hand, a pitifully small defense against the inferno. Elva didn't hesitate. She grabbed a bucket and joined the line, her body moving on pure instinct. The heat was a physical blow, sucking the air from her lungs. Smoke billowed around them, thick and acrid, stinging her eyes and choking her. She worked relentlessly, her arms screaming in protest, her lungs on fire. She was no longer a cook, no longer an outcast. She was a soldier in a desperate war. The flames licked at the edge of the corral, the wooden fences catching like kindling. The horses, trapped inside, thrashed and kicked, their cries of terror a sound that would haunt her forever. Without thinking, she dropped her bucket and ran toward the corral. Men shouted for her to come back, but she ignored them. The heat was blistering, the smoke so thick she could barely see. She fumbled with the heavy wooden latch, her fingers raw and clumsy. The metal was hot, searing her skin, but she didn't let go. Finally, the gate swung open. The horses bolted out, a thundering wave of panicked flesh, their eyes rolling white with fear. One of them clipped her shoulder, sending her sprawling into the dirt, but she scrambled back to her feet, her body bruised but her spirit unbroken. She turned back to the fire and saw Jed running toward her, his face a mask of soot and desperation. "The barn!" he yelled over the roar of the flames. Sparks, carried on the wind, had landed on the dry roof of the hay barn. Already, smoke was pouring from the eaves. It was their last line of defense. If the barn went up, the fire would jump to the bunkhouse and the main house in minutes. Everything would be lost. She ran alongside Jed, their shared goal a silent bond between them. They joined the men, who had shifted their focus to the barn, throwing bucket after bucket of water against the smoldering walls. But it was like trying to put out the sun with a teacup. The flames took hold, chewing through the dry timber with a terrible hunger. Elva knew there were animals inside, a few mules, the milk cow. "We have to get them out," she screamed. Jed grabbed her arm. "It's too late. The roof is about to go." But Elva pulled free. "I'm not leaving them." She plunged into the suffocating smoke of the barn. The heat was unimaginable, a living thing that wanted to cook her alive. She found the mule kicking and braying in its stall. She unlatched the door and drove it out, slapping its flank until it galloped into the relative safety of the yard. She turned back, coughing, her vision swimming with black spots. The roof above her groaned, a terrible final sound. Through the haze, she saw it, something that didn't belong. Glinting in the firelight, half hidden beneath a pile of burning hay, was a metal can, an oil can. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The cut fences, the poisoned bull, the fire. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. Someone had set this fire deliberately. A heavy timber crashed down from the ceiling, showering her with sparks. The world went black. She woke up on the ground outside, Jed's face hovering over hers. He had dragged her out, just as the roof collapsed in a deafening roar, sending a geyser of fire and embers into the night sky. The barn was gone. But then, a miracle. The wind shifted, and with it came the rain. Not a drizzle, but a torrential downpour, as if the heavens themselves had opened up. The rain hissed against the flames, turning the inferno into a smoldering, steaming ruin. The men shouted with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, some of them collapsing to their knees in the mud. They had survived, but they had lost so much. As the dawn broke, casting a sickly gray light over the charred and blackened landscape, a rider approached. It was the marshal, Wyatt Cololton, with 2 deputies and a very smug-looking Dusty Carver in tow. "Heard you had some trouble out here, McGraw," the marshal said, his eyes scanning the devastation with a cold, detached air. "We had a fire," Jed said, his voice flat, his face streaked with soot and grief. "An accident, I suppose?" the marshal asked, his lips curling into a slight smile. Before Jed could answer, Carver stepped forward. "It was no accident," he said, his voice ringing with false righteousness. He pointed a trembling finger at Elva. "I saw her. I saw her sneaking around the barn just before it started. She said it. She's crazy. Been trying to get McGraw's attention since the day she got here." A stunned silence fell over the weary ranch hands. The marshal dismounted and walked slowly toward the smoldering ruins of the barn. He poked around in the debris with the toe of his boot. Then he bent down and picked something up. It was the oil can. Rusted, blackened, but unmistakable. He held it up for everyone to see. Then he walked over to Elva, who was still sitting in the mud, too shocked to move. He dangled the can in front of her face. "This look familiar to you?" he asked, his voice like ice. Elva stared at him, her mind numb. It was a trap. A perfectly laid, diabolical trap. The marshal's eyes were cold and hard as stone. "Elva Jameson," he said, his voice booming across the ruined yard. "I'm placing you under arrest for arson and the attempted murder of everyone on this ranch." The world tilted on its axis. The faces of the ranch hands were a blur of confusion and suspicion. Carver was smiling, a triumphant, hateful grin. The marshal's deputies were moving toward her, their hands reaching for her arms. She was trapped. She was going to hang for a crime she didn't commit. She looked at Jed, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. For one terrible, heart-stopping moment, she thought he believed them. She thought he was going to let them take her. The deputies grabbed her arms, their fingers digging into her skin, hauling her to her feet. This was it. This was the end. "Wait." Jed's voice was quiet, but it cut through the morning air with absolute authority. The deputies froze. The marshal turned, an annoyed look on his face. Jed walked slowly forward until he was standing right in front of Elva, shielding her with his body. He ignored the marshal, his stormy eyes fixed on Carver. "You saw her, you say?" Jed asked, his voice dangerously low. "I did," Carver stammered, his bravado wavering slightly under Jed's intense gaze. "Sneaking around just like I said." "Funny," Jed said, a humorless smile touching his lips. "Because I was with her, in the cookhouse, right before the fire started." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Carver's face went pale. "You're lying. You're covering for your—" Jed took another step forward. "Am I?" He turned his gaze to the other ranch hands. "Anyone else see Carver last night? Anyone see him anywhere near the north pasture?" The men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. They were scared. Scared of Carver, scared of the marshal, scared of getting involved. Elva's heart sank. Jed's word against Carver's wasn't enough. They needed proof. Then a voice spoke up from the back. "I saw him." It was one of the younger hands, a boy named Billy who rarely spoke. All eyes turned to him. He was trembling, but he stood his ground. "I saw Mr. Carver. He was talking to someone down by the creek, a man I didn't recognize, and—" And I saw them hand him a bag of money. The marshal's face tightened. This is ridiculous. The boy is lying. Is he? Jed said, his eyes narrowing. He turned his attention back to the marshal. You were mighty quick to get out here, Marshal, and mighty quick to find that can, almost as if you knew what you were looking for. Suddenly, Elva's mind flashed back to the saloon, to the day Carver had cornered her. She remembered seeing Lillian Boonhart, her scarlet dress, her cutting smile. But she remembered something else, too. The marshal, Wyatt Cololton, had been there. He'd been standing with Lillian, their heads close together, their conversation low and secret. And she had seen it, Lillian slipping a roll of bills into the marshal's hand. Lillian Boonhart, Elva said, her voice surprisingly strong. She's behind this. The marshal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. The saloon owner? What would she have to do with this? You're delirious, girl. She wants this land, Jed said, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. A railroad speculator has been making offers for months. I keep turning them down. She's his local agent. She gets a big cut if she can get me to sell. He looked around at the devastation. Or if I'm ruined, or dead. The conspiracy was laid bare, ugly and shocking in the morning light. Lillian had been paying Carver to sabotage the ranch, to turn the men against Elva, to make it look like she was the source of all the trouble. The fire was meant to be the final act, the one that would either kill them all or see Elva hang, breaking Jed's spirit and forcing him to sell. And the marshal was in on it, paid to look the other way, paid to make sure the blame fell squarely on the innocent girl. The marshal's hand moved toward the gun at his hip. I'm not going to stand here and listen to these baseless accusations. She's under arrest. But before he could draw his weapon, Jed moved. He wasn't a gunman, not by reputation, but his hand was a blur. He didn't draw his own pistol. Instead, he reached into his coat. He pulled out the small wooden bird, the twin to the one he had given Elva. He held it up. My wife carved this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was murdered by a man who wanted our land, a man who set a fire to drive us out, a man who paid the law to look the other way. He looked directly at the marshal, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. History is not going to repeat itself today. That's when Elva remembered. The small bird in her own pocket. She pulled it out, her hand shaking. The two birds, identical, held up in the morning light, were a testament to a love that had been destroyed by greed, and a symbol of a new bond that refused to be. The ranch hands saw it. They saw the truth in Jed's eyes, the desperate courage in Elva's. Their fear was finally burned away by a hot surge of loyalty. They started to move, forming a silent, solid wall behind Jed and Elva. They were no longer a frightened mob. They were an army. The marshal looked at the ring of hard, determined faces surrounding him. He looked at Carver, who was now trembling like a cornered rat. He looked at the two small wooden birds, symbols of a justice he could not buy and a strength he could not break. He was outnumbered. He was exposed. He was beaten. With a curse, he holstered his gun. His reign of terror was over. The truth, once spoken, spread through the plains like a cleansing fire. When the ranch hands rode into town and told the story, the townspeople turned on their corrupt marshal, running him out on a rail. Carver, abandoned by his paymasters, confessed to everything, implicating Lillian Boonhart in the entire scheme. Her saloon was shuttered, her reputation ruined, and she vanished in the night, a disgraced shadow. Justice, it turned out, didn't always come from a man with a badge. Sometimes it came from the quiet courage of ordinary people who refused to let the darkness win. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began to heal. The men worked side by side, rebuilding the barn, their shared purpose forging a new and stronger bond. They treated Elva with a quiet reverence, a deep and abiding respect. She was no longer the bread burner. She was the woman who had faced the fire, inside and out, and had not been consumed. One evening, as the sun set over the recovering fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Elva stood with Jed on the porch of the main house. The air was cool and clean, the scent of fresh-cut lumber mixing with the smell of damp earth. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer filled with unspoken grief or uncertainty. It was filled with a quiet understanding, a shared strength, and the promise of a new beginning. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the small wooden bird in her pocket pressing against her hip. The world outside the borders of the ranch was still a hard and unforgiving place. But here, in this small pocket of the world they had saved together, she was finally home. She had survived the whispers, the lies, and the flames. She had learned that true strength wasn't about never falling. It was about rising again, every single time, from the ashes. The story of the bread burner was over. A new story, one of resilience, justice, and love, was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story of how a small act of courage can change the world, and you want to hear more tales of justice from the forgotten corners of history, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.